Hello there. If you're in the UK, you are likely to be familiar with GB News. It's a free-to-air, opinion-oriented news, television and radio channel that arrived in June 2021 and which refreshingly had no problem calling out lockdowns. If you're listening today from another part of the world, this is also for you because controlled opposition is a worldwide thing. Yes, I said it, and so early on as well. And I don't mean controlled opposition in a conspiratorial, difficult to pin down, difficult to define way, but a literal way, one that is evidenced and in plain sight. Because controlled opposition is exactly what GB News is. And today I'm going to tell you why I have thought that practically from the beginning. The People's Channel, as they like to call it, is actually run by the establishment. And there are many reasons why we can safely say this is. To start with, in the words of Vladimir Lenin, allegedly, the best way to control the opposition is to lead it ourselves. And that is exactly what is happening with GB News. First of all, some background. The concept for the channel was initially created in 2019 by Andrew Cole and Mark Schneider. They are the owners of All Perspectives Limited. It was announced in 2020 and began broadcasting on 13th of June 2021. By August 2022, Cole and Schneider had resigned as directors after their holdings in the company were purchased by backers Sir Paul Marshall and Legatum, more of which later. So the channel was launched by Andrew Neil, a seasoned establishment journalist. He launched the channel with the words, "We are proud to be British. The clue is in the name." However, Neil's pride turned out to be short-lived, and he only presented 9 shows and resigned from his role at the channel 3 months after its official launch. Neil had been on a contract worth $4 million and included stress among the reasons for departing GB News. In November 2021, Neil called his decision to lead the channel the single biggest mistake of his career. Andrew Neil, just to remind people, was the journalist who wrote in the Daily Mail that it was time to punish people who refused the experimental jab. He was never one of the people. He too always represented the establishment and is, in my opinion, clearly controlled opposition. Look, you don't get to party with so many politicians, past and present, like he does, and remain neutral. Of course, Andrew Neil has always been held up as an example of somebody who speaks truth to power. Sure you do, when you're, knocking back a bevy with former and present prime ministers. So common sense should already have told people that GB News was not exactly what they were claiming it to be. Nonetheless, GB News arrived at a time when people like me were so sick and tired of mainstream media support of the COVID narrative, and we were desperate for at least one outlet to buck the trend and speak up about the harms. But there was more that GB News was able to capitalize on. People were also sick and tired of culture and gender wars and were desperate for media to talk about the sudden rash of people who claimed to be born in the wrong body, who were taking the knee, who were, constantly flying the flag for LGBT, numerous letters. People were actually ticked off by the culture wars and wondered why media wasn't speaking up for them. Well, mainstream media was largely captured by the organizations that financially benefit from Black Lives Matter, the alphabet movement, the climate change narrative, and more. And that is why mainstream media aren't speaking up about them, because they're compromised, of course. At first, with GB News, there was promise, though, even for a cynic such as myself. And I've only become cynical because I've been in media for so long, and I've seen the revolving door and I've seen how it all works. And so it's not so much cynical as realistic. But as I say, at first there was promise, all these voices speaking out against lockdown and the culture wars. About time, what a relief, weren't we happy? But one by one, the truly radical voices disappeared from the channel. People like comedian Abby Roberts, who I happen to know and like, was a channel regular until she started to get just too close to the truth of the establishment cover-up during COVID. But nonetheless, it continued, the channel continued, even while dropping people who were reputable and were worth watching. And it continued to sort of work alongside this idea that it was a freedom fighting channel while pushing some of the most draconian measures around. But it is that loyalty to the channel and what it offered in the early days, which has blinded people to the monster that GB News really is. Because, as I say, when it arrived in 2021, it appeared to fill a much needed gap. Finally, a media platform with the potential to actually compete with mainstream media channels was talking truths about all manner of things. What we didn't realize at the time was that this was the Trojan horse. This was what drew alternative thinkers in, and it was a good one. But in actuality, the truth-seeking and freedom fighting was a minute part of the channel, where elsewhere had a political editor in the form of Tom Harwood, who was part of all manner of agendas, claimed to actually believe that people were born in the wrong body and actively promoted the gender madness. Equally, Harwood was an absolute COVID nightmare, promoting all aspects of it, including the experimental jabs. If ever there was a perfect illustration of a government shill, Harwood has to be it. Of course, I'm not suggesting that he is directly compromised in some way by the government, but that he has fulfilled the establishment narrative for them anyway. So a big round of applause for Tom. I was suspicious from the start because I couldn't see how old media could create a new media. The same people that had created the divisive legacy media and who were responsible for the dire, shambolic and divisive nature of it, and which carried out the establishment's official narratives to the letter, propping up government, propping up royalty, propping up climate change narrative, propping up really any government or establishment or globalist narrative, which is the function of legacy media. And I know that some people who watch me also watch GB News and have felt terrific loyalty towards GB News. And my aim is not to trample all over your feelings of having been betrayed in this way by a news channel that promised you one thing but gave you something else, but just to really alert people to what GB News is about and really was always about. So GB News appeared to be the place that legacy media staff went to when their usefulness in mainstream media and their handlers was coming to a close. There was the dinosaur, Alistair Stewart, who I got into a Twitter spat with once when he tried to ridicule people who asked questions about COVID-19. As I had said to him during our conversation, the fact is that it is the job of journalists to be curious, and people like Alistair Stewart were not curious around COVID. They completely propped up the narrative and betrayed the country and our people. So let's look at some other people that were brought in from legacy media that made me think, it's not going to be anything new or different. There was the BBC newsreader, Simon McCoy, who was brought in for the breakfast shift. Now, I can't stand any BBC newsreaders because they are anti-journalism, right? They are auto-cuties, males and females. Simon McCoy's appointment didn't bode well at all. And the fact that he was teamed with former Sky presenter Kirsty Gallagher was like the icing on the proverbial, really. Then, of course, there was Dan Wootton, formerly of The Sun, and a man who has been recently let go by GB News under the pretense of laughing along with Lawrence Fox to some nonsense, when we all know it's because Wootton is facing multiple allegations at the moment. And when Dan Wootton came out, and there were all these allegations about Dan Wootton, the station and him were saying, we're under attack from the establishment. You cannot get more establishment than Dan Wootton. So Dan Wootton really is basically out on his ear now. I mean, he was sort of, his time at GB News was paused recently. They said because on the back of the issue to do with Lawrence Fox making a crude comment, but it was nothing of the sort. The allegations are just too extensive, and I think GB News were just looking for a way to bump him. Mail Online had already got rid of him from being a regular columnist. And one of the reasons why there has been such silence around Dan Wootton in Britain's mainstream media is because he's worked for most of it. That's a fact. So are they concerned about what he may or may not have done when he was with them? Or is it that colleagues from these publications are implicated in the alleged stings that Dan Wootton was involved in? And that's just for starters. What about all these other mainstream media sellouts who would give their firstborn to be back on mainstream media? Nigel Farage, Eamon Holmes, Camille Tominey, Mark Dolan, Patrick Christie's, Isabel Oakeshott, Bev Turner, Stephen Dixon, Anne Diamond, Andrew Pierce, Mark Longhurst, Colin Brazier, etc., etc. Nana Akua, another BBC bod who has views that are frankly abhorrent. They belong to another century altogether. Nana is one of those presenters who wants things to be so much more punishing for people than is actually human. She was a major COVID pusher, and for that alone, she should never be trusted again. A PR once dared to make a video about so-called COVID heroes, e.g. people who spoke up through COVID. I was included, fine, okay. And I was okay with that until I realized that this same shoddy public relations woman had also included Nana Akua. Talk about rewriting history for propaganda purposes. I was absolutely appalled. And then let us not forget, it cannot be a people's channel because there are so many politicians serving and former who have earned a buck from the channel. GB News has had so many members of parliament from the government ruling party that it resembles a live from government HQ broadcast at times. Let's look at who's been there and who is still there. Well, let's see. There was husband and wife Conservative politicians, Philip Davis and Esther McVey. Esther McVey used to be the sidekick of Ian Duncan Smith when he was carrying out some of his most heinous, despicable acts in Parliament against sick and disabled people. Esther McVey was completely in accord with that agenda. One of the highest profile presenters who joined the channel in 2023. If ever there was a remnant of the old establishment that we need to do away with, Jacob Rees-Mogg is part of it. Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg is as far from being one of the people as I think it's humanly possible to be. I'm pretty sure his nanny still lives with them, taking care of his children. And, you know, he really is part of the old order. But there he is, propping up GB News. And who else? What other politicians is there? Lee Anderson of the Conservative Party, Michael Portillo, former Conservative. In fact, so indebted is the government to GB News that at the recent Conservative Party conference, GB News was the toast of leading Tories. Last month, GB News decided to stop playing games with everybody, and even while it was still saying it was the People's Channel, it really made an announcement to end all announcements when it announced that Boris Johnson, the compulsive lying former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, had signed on for his own show. I think that was the point that even the diehards could no longer ignore. And that's just out front, right? Those political influences are just what we see. What about the establishment political influences behind the scene, pulling the strings? Well, Conservative member of the House of Lords, Baroness Helen Morrissey, became a director of GB News' parent company, All Perspectives, in 2022. Behind the scenes, people had also come from legacy media and were really just doing the same thing over again. There was Jill Penlington, who was a one-time senior executive producer. She had worked for CNN, ITV and Sky News. Then there was Helen Warner, a former head of daytime at ITV and Channel 4. Helen was appointed head of television at GB News. She left after 4 months. I think it's absolute gaslighting for them to try and convince people that they are anti-establishment when it is so clearly not only run by establishment media hacks, but establishment politicians, and props up the establishment thoroughly. You know, how can it be the People's Channel when it's run and owned by such people? Isn't it, in fact, the most obvious example of controlled opposition that there is? It's gaslighting, and that's what it is, and I object to that. You know, GB News is the television version of The Sun. Talk TV should, by rights, be the television version of The Sun because it's owned by Murdoch. But no, GB News is. It's divisive, it's discriminatory, it's sexist, it's racist. There are bigots sitting around discussing things that they have absolutely no real knowledge about, but sounding off all the same. And they are working hand in hand with the British government to continue enslaving the people. It was a classic bait and switch, what GB News pulled, right? They had a few presenters who were anti-lockdown and asking important questions about the jabs, but they were the bait to draw people in at a time when people were so disenfranchised with the media trotting out the COVID narrative. So let's look at some of the people who have been used for the GB News honey trap. Well, most famously, of course, Mark Steyn. Let's talk about him. Much of the goodwill and good sentiment towards GB News has been created around a small handful of presenters, of which Mark Steyn was central to that. He was one of the few media people to give a voice to people who had suffered jab damage. It was very honourable what he was doing, and he was penalised for that after a number of Ofcom complaints were upheld against him. GB News made him responsible for any further penalties from Ofcom. Some might say that's quite a savvy move, but it's hardly protecting your journalist. So what you're doing is you want a journalist who speaks up and to whom the people can relate to, but you're not prepared to back them. And that's what happened. So Mark Steyn was out on his ear, and hardly any of the GB News presenters spoke up for him. So clearly there was no such solidarity going on there. Another man who has garnered much goodwill for GB News is Neil Oliver, who has been allowed to present a show at the weekends. Primarily it's his monologues, which people have taken to, and lots of people really like Neil Oliver. And on a human level, I quite liked Neil Oliver. He talks about revolution and uses lots of flowery words like Russell Brand, but he's also an establishment bod. Yes, I know that's hard for you to believe, but I don't know how you can call for a revolution while supporting royalty, which he does. I remember when GB News did a video to honour the Queen, and Neil Oliver was all, long may she reign over us. I mean, you're calling for a revolution on one hand, but you want the royal family. For me personally, I don't want any royals reigning over me, whether it's the Queen, whether it's Charles, whomever. That is a part of history that we should have long dispensed with. I know not everybody agrees with me on that, but it is okay for us to disagree, right? And also GB News has pushed through a shocking agenda on behalf of the royal family. Absolutely no doubt about it. Almost all of their presenters are pro-royal and anti-Meghan and Harry. Now, don't get me wrong, I am not a major fan of Meghan and Harry, not least because of their work involved in censoring the internet. And so I have a lot of problems with them. But I definitely am not somebody to uphold royalty, and GB News is. And actually, it's quite shocking, the sheer volume of verbiage that is said on GB News regarding Meghan and Harry. I mean, it is akin to stalking. I mean, it is not news in any way that could be described as such. Some of the other people who brought in their own audiences, there's Calvin Robinson, not my personal cup of tea, but some people in alternative media like him. Well, he was recently let go. And of course, Lawrence Fox was brought in. Now, don't get me started on Nepo baby Lawrence Fox, who has been given all the advantages of being part of an establishment acting family. He is part of the British establishment, but he still tries to convince everyone that he's come up from the streets. So who's behind the channel? Who's pulling the strings? Well, owner Paul Marshall is the god of GB News. So who is Paul Marshall? Well, he is the co-founder and chairman of Marshall Wace, one of Europe's largest hedge fund groups. The company was started in part with $50 million, half of which came from George Soros. So that should give you an idea of where Paul Marshall of GB News is coming from. If there is one individual who has invested more deeply in sowing division in this world than George Soros, I'd like to know who that is. Paul Marshall has an extensive and interesting history. Let's have a little look at what he's up to. As I say, he is the god of GB News. Marshall is also on the advisory board of ARC, the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, the so-called alternative to WEF, but is in fact almost a carbon copy of WEF. ARC is fronted by Jordan Peterson, who has latterly been revealed to be a jab-promoting Zionist who shakes hands with Benjamin Netanyahu and instructs Israel's PM to give them hell on X. He is not one of my people. He is one of theirs, but I shall save Jordan Peterson and ARC for another broadcast because there is so much to say about him. If ever there was a Pied Piper of the so-called freedom movement, Jordan Peterson is your man. And there was me thinking it was Russell Brand. Anyway, back to Paul Marshall. Who is he? He was born in Ealing, London in August 1959. He was sent to boarding school, and from there he went to St John's College, Oxford University to read history and modern language. He took an MBA at business school in France. He has an extensive political history. Here's a brief run through. He was a research assistant for Charles Kennedy, former leader of the Liberal Democrats. He has donated at least £200,000 to the Lib Dems. He left in 2015 over its policies on the European Union and its support of staying in the Union. In July 2016, Marshall donated $3,250 to Michael Gove's Conservative Party leadership campaign. Michael Gove, incidentally, was a keynote speaker at the ARC's convention this week in London, which is hilarious because Michael Gove, as everyone knows, was busy promoting the jibby jabby. So much for Jordan Peterson's great freedom-loving movement. I digress. In the same year that Marshall gave that money to Michael Gove, he donated £100,000 to the Brexit Leave campaign. In 2017, he gave funding to the political website Unheard. In 2019, he gave £500,000 to the Conservative Party. So this is a man who is used to influencing politicians and influencing political decisions when he flashes the cash. Now, naturally, he will deny this. They will all say he doesn't. But of course, funders absolutely influence politicians. Otherwise, they wouldn't bother giving money to them in the first place. It's an investment for them, right? And it was in 2021 that Marshall invested in a personal capacity, initially £10 million into GB News. He was temporarily chairman of the channel following Andrew Neil's resignation and was succeeded in April 22 by Alan McCormick. Both Marshall and McCormick are on the advisory board of ARC. See how they're all funneling through the same place. GB News is now jointly owned by Sir Paul Marshall, an investment firm Legatum, under the umbrellas of a holding company, All Perspectives Limited, which is headquartered in London. As of August 2022, All Perspectives Limited was controlled by 3 significant shareholders, all of whom work for Christopher Chandler's Dubai-based investment firm Legatum. The CEO of GB News is Angelos Frangopoulos, who formerly ran Sky News Australia. So you can clearly see that GB News is actually now primarily funded from Dubai. But hey-ho, let's keep waving the flag for Britain, yeah? The fact is, GB News is very dark, and it has been dark behind the scenes for a long time. In August 2023, Byline Times revealed that GB News had settled an employment claim for a 5-figure sum in which sexual harassment was alleged against its chief executive, Frangopoulos. It was also said that they had shut down serious racism and bullying allegations raised by 2 other journalists, with further payouts and gagging agreements. So it's interesting stuff. They are regulated by Ofcom. Of course, you have to question in the first place, how independent and for the people any channel can be when it is regulated by Ofcom, right? They've had endless breaches. It's almost like it's deliberate. It's deliberate to discredit any of the half decent stuff they have reported on. The channel has been found to have breached Ofcom standards on a number of occasions, and as of August 2023 was the subject of 7 investigations into its compliance with Ofcom's due impartiality rules. So it's quite interesting stuff. I obviously, as a freelance journalist, I have a lot of problems with regulation because Ofcom, as a regulator, is involved with the government. Of course, they like to create this idea that they are independent, but they report to government. So how independent are they really? If Ofcom has any use, surely it should be to stop GB News rewriting history to accommodate their newest acquisition. And what I'm talking about here is Boris Johnson, former PM. Honestly, if I really described to you what I think about him, I would probably be kicked off of this platform. So I'm not going to go into that, other than to say it's all out there. Everybody knows who Boris Johnson is. A compulsive liar is just one of the things that he is. We are currently hearing during the UK COVID inquiry about Johnson's behaviour, and GB News and their presenters are busy playing down his role, saying, you know, this wasn't Boris's fault. You know, he didn't really want that. He could see that lockdowns were a problem. For real? Why didn't he do something about it then? Right? Why didn't he do something about it? That is a man high on his own power. Right? Boris Johnson has never got one single role in his life on merit. It's based on who he knows and what he has been prepared to do while in that seat. So he is the latest representative of the government's ruling party to rock up on GB News, the actual former Prime Minister who was in place when the most draconian, punishing period in our history was taking place, and the channel that was said to be anti everything he was doing is now employing him. If that's not absolute gaslighting at its finest, I don't know what is. So I think, you know, if Ofcom has any role whatsoever, surely it should be to stop GB News downplaying the role of what Boris Johnson has done to our country, right? Maybe the rival of Boris has finally awoken many people from their GB News loyalty slumber. It's controlled opposition. It's there to enslave you. It's time to break the chains. GB News was never the people's channel. They just did a really good job of convincing an awful lot of people that it was.